On the night of June 3, 1944, the wind howled across the English Channel. Waves crashed violently against the ships anchored along the southern coast of England. Soldiers, thousands of them, waited in silence. Some were writing letters home. Others cleaned their weapons or stared into the dark water, unsure if they would see another sunrise. They were ready for war, ready to fight for freedom. But they were waiting for one thing that no weapon could control: the weather. Britain was at a breaking point. For years, the country had stood almost alone against Nazi Germany. London had been bombed, cities destroyed, families torn apart. The war had taken its toll. Food was rationed, streets were filled with rubble, and people lived with fear every day. But now there was hope. The Allies were preparing the largest military invasion in history. If it worked, they could finally push back the Nazi forces and free Europe. The operation had a name: D-Day. In a small room not far from the coast, a man stared at a map filled with arrows and storm symbols. His name was James Stagg, a quiet and serious man who had once studied clouds and winds in Scottish hills. Now his forecast would decide the fate of thousands. Stagg was the chief meteorologist for the Allied forces. His job was simple in theory but terrifying in practice. Tell General Dwight D. Eisenhower if June 5, 1944, was a good day to attack. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, faced the biggest decision of his life. Around him were generals, maps, and military plans. But no amount of training could help him control nature. If the weather was bad, planes wouldn't fly, ships would crash, and soldiers would die. If the weather was good, there was a chance, just a chance, that the war could turn. The plan was massive. More than 150,000 troops from the United States, Britain, and Canada were ready to cross the Channel and land on the beaches of Normandy, France. Thousands of ships, planes, and tanks waited for the signal, but the operation needed perfect timing. The tides had to be just right. The moon had to give enough light. The winds had to stay calm. One mistake could cost everything. At first, the weather seemed okay, but then something changed. Dark clouds gathered. The wind picked up. A storm was coming. Many weather teams believed it would last for days. Some suggested delaying the attack by weeks, but Stagg saw something different. A small break in the storm, a 36-hour window of calm, might appear on June 6th. It was a risky call and not everyone believed him. Stagg had to stand in front of powerful generals and defend his forecast. He was not a soldier, not a fighter. He was a man of science, used to silence and study, but now his words carried more weight than bullets. If he was wrong, thousands would die. If he was right, history would change. At the same time, the German High Command believed the Allies would not attack in such bad weather. In fact, many German officers left their posts to attend war games in Paris. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man in charge of defending the coast, went home to give his wife a birthday gift. The storm, they believed, would keep the enemy away. But back in England, tension filled the air. General Eisenhower paced back and forth. He asked questions. He demanded answers. Finally, he looked at Stagg and listened. The meteorologist spoke calmly. He pointed to the charts. He explained the break in the weather. Eisenhower nodded slowly. He turned to his team and gave the order. "Okay, we'll go." The next hours were filled with movement. Soldiers were woken in the middle of the night. Orders were given. Planes took off. Ships moved into position. Letters were sealed and handed to messengers. It was happening. D-Day was on. While everyone prepared for war, few understood how close it all came to being cancelled, how one decision, one voice in a room, had changed the course of history. James Stagg returned to his room, exhausted. He had done his part. Now the world would watch and wait. Across England, mothers hugged their children. Wives whispered prayers. Radios remained silent, waiting for news. The storm outside had calmed slightly, but the storm inside every heart had only grown. Everyone knew something big was coming. They just didn't know if it would bring victory or ruin. As the first light of June 6 broke across the sky, a new chapter in the war began. Planes flew low over the water. Paratroopers jumped into darkness. Ships approached the French coast. And on the beaches of Normandy, young men from across the world would face fire, fear, and fate. But before all of this, before the blood and bravery, there was a man, a map, and a forecast. A moment when hope rested not on guns but on clouds. And it all started with a storm no one believed would pass. That morning, as boots touched sand and bullets flew through the air, the world held its breath. The gamble had begun, and the outcome would depend on forces no one could fully control. June 6, 1944. The sky over Normandy was grey but not stormy. The sea was rough but not deadly. It was just enough. The break in the weather that James Stagg had predicted arrived almost exactly as he said it would. It wasn't perfect, but it was possible. As the first Allied soldiers stepped onto the beaches, the world changed. But behind the roaring guns and crashing waves, a quieter story was unfolding. One of confusion, disbelief, and missed chances on the German side. In Berlin, Nazi leaders were confident. For weeks, they had watched the skies and followed weather reports. Their meteorologists, many using outdated data and limited radar, had predicted the storm would last much longer. They believed no general in his right mind would launch an invasion under such conditions. So when the Allied ships began to appear on the horizon, it wasn't just a surprise, it was a shock. Field Marshal Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, wasn't even at his post. He had gone home to Germany to give his wife a pair of shoes for her birthday. He assumed there would be no invasion until mid-June at the earliest. Many other commanders were also away. Some were in Paris attending war games. The German defenses were strong on paper, but on June 6 they were unprepared and undermanned. As Allied planes dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines, German officers scrambled to respond. Phones rang. Messages flew across radio channels. Confusion reigned. Some believed it was a trick. Others thought it was a small raid, not a full-scale invasion. Hitler himself was asleep when the invasion began. His staff was too afraid to wake him. By the time the truth was clear, it was too late. Thousands of Allied troops were already on the beaches. The German response was slow, delayed by poor communication and disbelief. Rommel rushed back, but even his skill couldn't stop the tide. The carefully built Atlantic Wall, the Nazis' great line of defense, was cracking. Back in England, James Stagg listened to the first reports with quiet relief. His forecast had held. The winds had calmed just enough for planes to fly and boats to land. The low clouds provided some cover. The sea, though rough, did not stop the assault. Nature had given the Allies a narrow door, and they had charged through it. General Eisenhower, watching the events unfold from headquarters, understood how close they had come to disaster. If they had waited another day, the storm would have returned worse than before. The next weather window might not have come for weeks. Hitler would have strengthened his defenses. More soldiers would have died. The war might have dragged on for years. The Germans quickly realized their mistake. By trusting their forecast and ignoring the possibility of an attack in bad weather, they had been caught off guard. The Allies had used their mistake against them. And behind that decision was one man, one voice in a crowded room who had seen something others missed. It wasn't just a victory of weapons or numbers. It was a victory of knowledge, of courage, of trust. Stagg had convinced generals to believe in something invisible, a break in the clouds, a shift in the wind. In doing so, he helped change the course of history. As the day wore on, the beaches of Normandy turned red with blood. Soldiers from many nations fought and fell. There were moments of heroism, of terror, of sacrifice. The cost was high. But the landing succeeded. The beachheads were secured, and the road to Paris and to the end of the war was open. The German command struggled to recover. They sent reinforcements, launched counterattacks, but the damage was done. The Allies had a foothold in Europe. From there they would push forward, liberating town after town until the Nazi regime collapsed. Back home, families gathered around radios, waiting for news. Reports came slowly at first. There was no live television, no instant updates. Just voices from far away describing battles, names, places. People prayed, cried, and hoped. Some would never see their loved ones again. Others would get letters filled with mud, sand, and love. In military rooms across England, Stagg was now a quiet hero. He received no medals that day, no parades, but those who knew understood. He had taken a risk. He had stood his ground. And he had been right. The forecast that fooled the Führer was more than just a lucky guess. It was a product of science, teamwork, and experience. Stagg and his team had gathered data from ships, planes, and weather stations. They had debated, argued, and analyzed every piece. In the end, Stagg had made a call that others were too afraid to make. Years later, historians would study that moment. They would point to the charts, the dates, the decisions. But the truth remains simple. A man looked at the sky and saw a chance. A leader listened. And together, they moved the world. As night fell on June 6th, fires still burned along the coast. The sea carried the sounds of war back to England. But in the sky, the clouds began to return. Rain started to fall. The storm was coming back just as Stagg had warned. The window was closing. Had they waited just one more day, none of it might have happened. The beaches would have been empty, the defenses stronger, the war longer, and so as history turned on that narrow forecast, the world came to understand that even in war, sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest weight. From this moment on, the battle was no longer just against the Nazis. It was also a battle against time, distance, and weather. But the door was open now, and the march toward victory had begun. By the morning of June 7, 1944, the beaches of Normandy were under Allied control. The sand was scattered with wreckage and the bodies of those who had fallen. Medics worked tirelessly. Smoke hung heavy in the air. But despite the chaos, one truth echoed through every command post, every radio message, every whisper among the troops. The landing had worked. Against all odds, the Allies had broken through. Far from the front lines, James Stagg sat quietly in a modest office. The tension of the previous days had lifted, but he felt no joy, only exhaustion. He hadn't fired a weapon, hadn't stormed a beach, yet his role was no less vital. It was his voice that had helped launch D-Day. A scientist, a family man, a reserved soul, now the man whose forecast had changed the world. News of the invasion spread fast. Newspapers printed bold headlines. Citizens in London cheered. In New York, people stopped in the streets to listen to radio updates. Families cried, prayed, and hoped for letters from sons and husbands. But very few knew of the meteorologist behind the scenes. Stagg's name was not on the front page. His forecast remained a quiet secret shared among generals. As the Allies pushed further into France, historians would later reflect on the importance of June 6th. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a turning point in the war. But the real turning point had come days before, in a dimly lit room where a man argued for a narrow window of weather. That moment changed everything. German commanders realized their mistake too late. The false confidence they had placed in their own forecasts, combined with the unexpected storm, had blinded them. They had assumed no army would attack in such conditions. But Stagg had seen what others could not. A break, a breath, a possibility. His success wasn't luck. It was built on years of work. Stagg had studied weather patterns since before the war. He had climbed hills in Scotland with notebooks and instruments. He had worked with pilots, sailors, and scientists. And during the war, he had led a team of rival forecasters, each bringing their own data and doubts. In that pressure cooker of opinions, Stagg stood firm. He had also faced personal battles. His wife was pregnant during those tense days in June. While forecasting the fate of an army, he also feared for the safety of his own family. The emotional weight was enormous. Yet he remained focused, calm, clear. In the months that followed D-Day, the Allies advanced rapidly. Paris was liberated in August. By the end of the year, German forces were retreating. Victory was still far off, but the tide had turned. And it had turned on a forecast. Years later, James Stagg was knighted for his service. He returned to a quieter life, away from cameras and headlines. He never sought fame. He simply did his job and did it with integrity and care. To those who knew the full story, he was more than a meteorologist. He was a man who had helped save lives with words instead of weapons. The war itself came to an end in 1945. Europe slowly began to rebuild. Soldiers returned home. Families reunited. Memorials were built on the beaches where the future had once hung in the balance. People would visit those places and talk about bravery, sacrifice, and courage. Few would mention the weather. But in truth, without that narrow window of calm, everything might have been lost. Stagg's legacy lives on in every modern weather forecast. Today, meteorologists use satellites, computer models, and global networks. But back then, it was maps, charts, radios, and human instinct. Stagg's work proved that weather was not just about rain or sunshine. It was about life and death. In classrooms and documentaries, D-Day is often shown through tanks, soldiers, and ships. But behind those images is the story of a decision, A choice made not with guns but with graphs. And at the heart of that story is a man most people never heard of. There's a lesson in that. Not all heroes wear medals. Not all battles are fought on the front lines. Sometimes the world turns because someone took a risk, stood alone and told the truth. James Stagg didn't lead troops or charge bunkers. But in that critical moment, he led with knowledge and courage. He faced doubt, pressure and fear. And in doing so, he became a silent hero of one of history's most important days. So when we remember June 6, 1944, let's also remember June 4th and 5, the stormy nights, the tense meetings, the quiet forecast. Let's remember the man who looked into the clouds and saw a future no one else could. Because in the end, the success of D-Day was not only about strength and strategy, it was also about timing. And timing on that day came from a storm and the one man who believed it would pass. In the shadows of generals and gunfire, it was a quiet forecast that reshaped the course of history. James Stagg's courage to speak truth in a moment of doubt gave the Allies the chance they desperately needed. His story reminds us that not all heroes are found on the battlefield. Some are found in silence, staring at the sky. If you made it to the end of this story, leave a comment below with the word Stormbreaker to let us know. And don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss a new documentary just like this.